Welcome to Gods and Movie Makers, otherwise known as Motion Scripture, the show about how religion and the Bible shape the stories we tell on screen.
I'm Joe Scales.
And I'm Katie Turner. On this season, The Chosen One. Why were they chosen? Do they want to be chosen? And why are we so attracted to these sorts of stories? We're joined today by Matt Page to talk about The Last Temptation of Christ. Matt has been researching, writing, and talking about cinema and the Bible for over 20 years. In that time, he's been a guest speaker for small groups, churches, university courses, and at conferences. He was a talking head in the TV documentary The Passion, Films, Faith, and Fury. He has published essays on Jesus in Italian films, 21st century depictions of the Nativity, Roberto Rossellini, and the history of the biblical canon on film. He's been running the Bible Films blog since 2006, and earlier this year, his book 100 Bible Films was published with the British Film Institute. If you are at all interested in depictions of the Bible in cinema, I highly recommend this very readable book. I promise it will introduce you to films that you haven't heard of. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here.
We have a couple kind of offhand questions before we really get into the main chat. And the first is, what made you decide to start your blog?
I'm particularly interested in this because your blog was incredibly useful to me when I was on my master's course. I came across it just Googling and was like, oh, this is a treasure trove of movies.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was a few different things really, but I've been kind of looking at this area for about 5 years, connected with a few people. And I was involved in an online discussion forum called Arts and Faith, and I was feeling a little bit like most of the discussion I think was people weren't that into the Bible films, and I was feeling I was spending a lot of time putting stuff on there. Wasn't really doing it for most people, so I decided to. And a couple of friends had started blogs, and I thought, and blogs were a bit more all the rage back in 2006. So I decided to start then, and I've managed to just about keep it going over the years. Sometimes it's been pretty busy, and I've had lots of time to do it, and other times it's been a bit sparse. But yeah, I still really enjoy it, and I'm glad it was so useful because that was really my heart when I started doing it, was to make something that would be useful for people, and people would be able to find stuff.
So when did you first see The Last Temptation of Christ? Was that within the process of Bible and Films blog or well before that?
No, it was before the blog, but it was towards the start of getting into this subject, I suppose. So I heard about it a lot. So I remember in 1988 when it came out, I think I was 13, and I remember hearing a Radio 4 program about it and kind of being able to see the point of view that was being made about the filmmakers. But at the time we were kind of going to church as well, so I was aware of both sides, but obviously too young to see it, and eventually got around to seeing it around 2000 because I'd started looking at various lives of Christ. It was much, much harder then. Obviously there was no YouTube, the internet was still barely up and running, and even things like Amazon. I think I remember the name of the company I bought this film from on VHS, and it wasn't Amazon because they were just one of a number of people that you would buy VHSs from then. So pretty early on in this whole process, because I think it was, a film was always interesting. At that stage, there were only 10, 15 films that you could get your hands on fairly easily.
So before we launch into discussing the film in some depth, we'll do a quick film synopsis to bring our listeners up to speed.
God loves me. I know he loves me. I want him to stop. I can't take the pain. The voices and the pain. I want him to hate me. I fight him and make crosses so he'll hate me. I want him to find somebody else. I want to crucify every one of his messiahs.
The Last Temptation of Christ is a 1988 film directed by Martin Scorsese. Based on Nikos Kazantzakis' book of the same name, the film likewise generated some controversy around its portrayal of Jesus, as we see him unsure of himself and his purpose. The film takes seriously the question, what if Jesus doubted who he was or what his role was meant to be? The story follows his ministry in a way that often departs from the narrative of the canonical Gospels. At his final moment on the cross, the doubt creeps back and he is tempted one last time. The story itself has some interesting things to say about the nature of chosen ones. Between this and Harry Potter, talking to snakes might be a sign that your destiny has arrived.
The Last Temptation of Christ is fairly different from your standard Jesus film, I would say. Don't get a nativity, we don't get a resurrection, we don't have a trial before the high priest, the Virgin Mary hardly features at all. Scorsese opens the film with Kazantzakis' opening lines from his own book, and I'm just going to read that line for our listeners. The dual substance of Christ, the yearning, so human, so superhuman, of man to attain to God, or more exactly, to return to God and identify himself with him, has always been a deep, inscrutable mystery to me. So the idea being addressed here in this quote is that of the Hypostatic Union, which is the basic Christian principle that Christ's nature is made up of two substances. He is both fully man and fully God. But what is Scorsese doing with this idea in his film?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to try and work out what he actually thinks that is, because, I kind of aware of, theologically and kind of, I guess, Christian history of the idea of God, Jesus being fully God and fully man, but that's not necessarily the way that Scorsese sees it. And, I still wonder about when he says those words, when he puts them on the screen, what's he actually thinking, and what is his understanding of Jesus and who he is? Because it's that kind of idea of the fully God, fully man dual nature is not an easy concept to get your head around. I think people often think it's half and half, which is not, I guess, Christian orthodoxy, but it's a version that makes a bit more sense to people. But I'm still not entirely sure when I watch the film that that's necessarily what he's about. I think he's almost that thing that Paul says about, what I wanted to do, I found it hard to do, and that thing of, the battle between doing the right thing, knowing what the right thing is, and actually being able to do it. And the kind of, coming back to the theme of the chosen one, hearing a call on your life that you don't want to do, and trying to kind of battle between the spirit and the flesh, I suppose, in that way.
There's almost like a real lack of divine action throughout the film. So you get Satan popping up a lot, or some devil or some tempting figure, but there's not really any divine. So I do almost wonder this dual nature is less about God and human, and what you're saying, this almost, he's got a sense of his purpose and what he also wants to do, and it's that wrestling between almost destiny and his own desire, if you like.
Yeah, I'm very keen to look at the film in the context of Scorsese's other work, and I think you kind of see that theme coming through in other films. So I guess particularly Silence is a film that draws on that idea of what you feel you should be doing, and the kind of the flesh and the temptation there, and essentially that is a 3-hour film about people knowing that they're meant to hold on and not deny God, and being put through the most extreme pressure, under the most extreme pressure to do that. And yeah, it's a kind of an interesting trajectory between those two films, and it crops up in various other films as well of his.
There is a real battle with doubt in Silence also, and I think that you get that battle of doubt here as well. Silence is a much quieter film, not to play off the name or anything, but it is. And I think it's really easy for people to see how Silence is a faith film. But people really struggled in the run-up to The Last Temptation being released, and part of the reason Scorsese included that text from the book was in order to really establish right away that he was not making a strictly gospel film. And they even added a further disclaimer: the film is not based on the Gospels, but upon the fictional exploration of the eternal spiritual conflict. I'm assuming, having looked into The Last Temptation, that you're aware of a lot of the controversy.
Yeah, well, very much. I mean, I was, as I say, I was kind of alive at the time and old enough to kind of be aware of it. And I think, just to put it into context, it was in the late 80s, and certainly in this country, and I would imagine to a similar degree in America, the issue of kind of controversial depictions of faith and other related things was very much in the kind of the currency of the day. It was very much being talked about a lot. So at the same time as this, we'd had Jean-Luc Godard's Hail Mary three years before, where I think the protests were even stronger in France, and Godard himself got attacked after making that film. We had, we've just had, in the last few days, we've had Salman Rushdie being attacked for a fatwa, but that was started in the late 80s. again, similar time, may even have been 1988. Serrano's photograph, Piss Christ, was taken in 1987. That was a very controversial piece of work at the time as well. There was another film called Visions of Ecstasy, which was kind of a short avant-garde film that depicted, I think it's St. Teresa, kind of having a kind of sexual fantasy involving the cross and Jesus on the cross. And there was generally a lot of talk about video nasties as well, and this idea of, what should be censorship, and people like, in Britain we had this woman called Mary Whitehouse that was mobilising a lot of protests about content of stuff, because video was a new technology, it was emerging, and there was a kind of a window where the kind of stuff that gets circulated on YouTube now or just in video things, at the time there was a bit of a market that some people exploited of being able to film a cheap movie on VHS and then circulate it kind of under the radar a little bit. And so all these things were going on at the same time. That wasn't Scorsese's plan. He'd been intending to film this story for a long time, but as it happened, it kind of was launched in the middle of all these other controversies going on, and it was, and it's probably the biggest of all of them.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I mean, when you mentioned some of them, I was thinking, oh yeah, that took place but I hadn't thought about it within that broader context. I had really thought about the controversy being just about the film rather than sort of, I guess, bubbling tension around these ideas of what is okay to depict and what is okay to say. And people were really upset. Some things that they had heard from I think it was a screening in New York, and some stuff leaked about that, particularly in the final temptation at the end of the film when Jesus has sexual romantic relationship. I mean, he doesn't actually, right?
That's
like,
my
it's
reading
just
of it.
a vision, but that the concept of that upset people quite a lot, and there were a lot of protests in the U.S. And I think in a Paris theater, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into a theater. So yeah, big deal. But I hadn't connected it to all that other stuff. So that makes so much more sense when you think about it within the broader context.
And I think it's worth pointing out as well that Kazantzakis' book itself was controversial in its day. The kind of controversy around that had died off because it had been 35 years since it had been released. I think it was released in the 50s. But it wasn't like it was just based on, early reports of things. I think it was, it was a kind of, I guess, an ongoing story in the sense of that novel had been banned and had been proved controversial, and I think there were stuff from the Vatican had marked it down in some way. But also, I mean, it kind of seems almost hilarious now, but even like Jesus of Nazareth, which is the kind of most tame and, middle of the road portrayal of these issues, even that there was controversy around it. And originally, I think it was General Motors were due to sponsor it originally, and the word got out that Zeffirelli was going to do this portrayal of a more human Christ, which is kind of hilarious looking back. And because of that, there was a bit of a hoo-ha, and certain groups protested, and General Motors decided they weren't going to sponsor it and pulled the plug on the funding. So it was a kind of time when these things were regularly contested, and obviously, Life of Ryan a couple of years after that as well. So
watching it now in 2022, I find it slightly fascinating that this comes across as quite a pious film in some of its themes and the ideas it's trying to wrestle with. It doesn't feel like some of the examples are deliberately antagonistic or trying to do something that attacks a tenet of Christianity or certain elements. So there's something slightly jarring to think about why this generated controversy. But I think you've really nicely illustrated that even dealing with Jesus on screen was this kind of thing. And it's not surprising that this film perhaps also caught that, even if it's not Piss Christ is the one that comes to mind. Very similar time.
Yeah, it's surprisingly conservative theologically. I think if you take the imagery out of it, and assuming that you do read the ending as a temptation or as a something that's going on in Jesus's mind as he's dying, which is how I would read it, but I know not everyone does read it that way, then it's it's very conservative. Jesus hears God's call in his life. He starts his ministry. He meets with John the Baptist. He, performs miracles, does teaching, gets betrayed by Judas, gets crucified, dies on the cross. And then I would say there is a resurrection. I'd say that kind of cinematic ending does that as a way of doing that. Now, that's a much more conservative portrayal of the story than a year later, Jesus Montreal, which was kind of praised by a lot of church groups and was much better received, even though essentially it kind of has a much more controversial take on Jesus and essentially denies the resurrection outright. So it's kind of interesting. I find that really interesting, and I think I mentioned Godard's film already a few years before. I mean, that's even more conservative. Again, imagery less so, but in terms of the story it's telling. But the protests were even stronger in some ways for that. So it's always seemed strange to me that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I enjoy about it so much, and to me as not a Christian, but somebody who has studied and understands Christianity, I think fairly well, is that if you drill down to the concept that Christianity is based on, that this person is fully human and fully divine, what that means, what that must be to experience that, to have that tension within oneself, it is fascinating that it hasn't been explored more, that we have focused so much on God and so little on the humanity. But in this film, we get so much of the humanity. So we see a lot of things that we don't usually see in depictions of Jesus. So we see character development.
Yeah.
We never see character development in depictions of Jesus. And I think that's really, from my point of view, beautifully signposted through costume change that he experiences, and his hair grows and he becomes the sort of iconographic Christ as he's coming to terms with himself. But we also see lovely other bits of his humanity. He dances at the wedding at Cana, like this free, he just seems free to dance. And he also has sexual desire, as all humans do. Is there any bit of that portrayal of the humanness of Jesus that really speaks to you or really strikes you?
I mean, the first time I watched the film, I was kind of aware of quite a lot of the story and how it works and the kind of the sexual content. And I think I kind of, had a rough view on how I felt about that. But what really struck me was, and it took me quite a while to work out what was happening when I first saw it, actually. It's not at all, from some of the kind of bits I'd read about it before, it wasn't at all, I was quite disorientated trying to work out where we are in the story when it starts off. But those opening scenes, where Jesus is kind of hearing the call of God and hearing that he is going to be the chosen one and is trying to deal with that, and the idea of that being a terrible thing, goes to quite extreme levels to kind of push against that and to get away from that, and the book brings this out a bit more. But that was what really struck me, because I mean there have been different views through church history about what Jesus' self-knowledge was, and I mean you know the artworks better than I do, Katie, but I'm aware of certain artworks where you kind of see Jesus as a child with a vision of the whole universe. Not in a thought bubble, but that's how I'm picturing it right now. But that kind of idea, and then the idea of kenosis and him kind of developing his knowledge, and at what point did these things work themselves out and come to him? But I think it tends to be very sanitized, and here it really kind of gets to the nature of what's happening, of that, the enormous amount of pressure of potentially being in that role, and obviously the kind of the physical torment of it that's coming. And that was the thing that really struck me, the fact that actually this would have been a very grave. Grave's not quite the right word, but do you know what I mean? Just the kind of the impact of, okay, this is who you are and this is what you're going to do, or just kind of hearing that call, which at some point it would have emerged if you follow the kind of Gospels accounts of things. Then that would mess your head up. and even in the film, it's gradually emerged. And I think, again, one of the things that's interesting about the film is Jesus doesn't really know what he's doing. I was watching it again the other night, and and Judas is going insane because he keeps changing his mind, and he keeps saying, well, look, I don't really know what I'm doing and what the call is, and is it love, is it the axe, is it the temple, and going through all these different things. So it is a film that, as you say, one of the rare ones that has character development in it. About 10 or 11 years later, there was a TV version of the story called Jesus, starring Jeremy Sisto as Jesus, and it did a very toned down version of some of these things, which was quite interesting because these were things that not have been done really in Jesus films up to this point. So
we talked about Jesus' character and his development, but I'm also fascinated what the film does with the characters around him. So on the plus side, Judas is a major figure and has quite a lot to do in that role. And you'd mentioned in the brief summary that Judas kind of betrays him, but it's fascinating that Judas doesn't want that to happen in some ways and has to be talked into it. So we've got, on the one hand, Judas is really brought in and given quite an interesting role. And then Mary is also, I wish they'd done more with Mary, the mother, because she's very peripheral. And they do have the great scene of him kind of just say, I don't know you. But there's nothing really for her to do. And I kind of, building around the world around Jesus and the characters around him in the film, I think also situates him in the same way, much more in this humanizing narrative. And also, I think in discussions with Katie, we thought, well, this film really exemplifies his chosenness in that sense and how people play off him. But are there any key moments that you think might speak to that?
I think the relationship with Judas is really interesting, actually. Essentially, it's a recurring role in Scorsese's films, the buddy role. And so you can think of the brother in Raging Bull and various other films of his, that there is this kind of special buddy role, often played by Keitel at Mean Streets again. And this is very much that role, that it's a kind of sparring person. There's a close relationship between the two. And I think, not want to go too far down this line, but as well, there's quite often in Scorsese's films this sense of the tension between the buddy and the wider group of male friends and the female love interest, essentially. So Wolf of Wall Street is a more recent one that people may have seen a bit more. You've very much got the idea of the tension coming in, of Margot Robbie's character comes in and potentially displacing, and eventually she gets kind of shoved out by the male relationships in that film. And so it's not necessarily that surprising that Mary Magdalene, after Jesus has quote unquote saved her, goes away really until the temptation scene, and similarly that the mother of Jesus isn't there as those male relationships develop, and particularly the dominant one with Judas.
For me, the relationship with Judas is one of the key things that I think separates Jesus in this film as being more of a chosen one from the classic Saviour. Because one of the things that we really get with chosen one characters, not always, but often, is that they have a support system. So they have people that, like, without those people, they're never going to achieve the thing that they're meant to achieve. So we have Ron and Hermione for Harry Potter and Samwise Gamgee for Frodo, who really gets him. I mean, without Sam, Frodo does not drop that ring into Mordor. Neo in The Matrix has Trinity. And here Jesus has Judas. And at the very end, when he's been tempted, it's Judas who gets him back onto that cross to finish what he is supposed to do. Although if it's a vision, he never really left the cross.
Yeah.
But,
and it's probably the only film that I can think of off the top of my head where Jesus does need another person, where he has that need for people.
Yeah. Judas is so central to Jesus being who he is in this movie. And the fact that it's Judas who's been chosen to play that role, not John, not Peter. I think that's really interesting too. So we get this new complex portrait of Judas.
And that's interesting from a textual point of view, because some scholars would say that the Judas character is kind of brought in as a shadow self, and almost a kind of anti-Jesus figure, almost brought in as a foil. And that wasn't necessarily a historical character. I mean, I guess that's probably a bit of a passé 30 years ago type discussion within academia today. But that idea, I think, sits quite interestingly with that whole thing of, like you were just saying at the end, when it's actually quote unquote Judas that is the one that gets him back on the cross. Judas is portrayed as a physical, actual person that is there and in the stories. But it's kind of interesting, given what we were saying at the start about the film being a metaphor for the battle between flesh and the soul. I guess there's just something there in terms of that idea of Judas being a kind of shadow self, I suppose.
So do you see that really in the scene where Judas and Jesus are arguing about the kingdom? And for Judas, it's here on earth right now. We bring justice to people now in this reality. And Jesus says, no, it's in the world to come.
Maybe. I mean, that connection is something that's only really just kind of occurred to me as we've been talking about it. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting way of thinking about the film, because, as I say, there was a period where, I guess with a lot of the Jesus seminar type era, that kind of discussion around, was Judas a real disciple or was he kind of brought in? And similarly, like say Barabbas as well, you kind of get a few of these characters in the Gospels that are close to Jesus but not Jesus, and they kind of have some of those similarities. I don't think Scorsese was deliberately trying to play up to that. I don't know. I think sometimes with these films you just kind of see the reflections of ideas bouncing around them sometimes. And I think that's one that occurs to me in terms of Judas's role.
Also how Judas understands Jesus' mission seems to be something quite different. And there's the wonderful scene when he comes out of the desert or out of the wilderness, and the disciples have been waiting for him and having a really, feels like quite a true to life argument amongst themselves about what they want to do and where they want to go. And the film doesn't really telegraph it that well. I almost missed it. But you have a couple different representations of what Jesus holds in his hand. So in one, they see him pulling his heart out, and Judas is watching him and he's got an axe. I think it recalls some earlier scenes that Judas has kind of talked about this axe and some of John's message. So there's this really shifting image of who Jesus is, not just in his own eyes, but also in the eyes of other characters in the film. And Paul goes so far as to say, you don't matter.
They all see in him what they want to see in him. They're projecting. And I think that's what you get the argument between them before he comes out of the wilderness. So I thought that was a really wonderful exploration of what belief is. To pick back up on Judas, in so many ways, I find him a completely intriguing character in this film. And I think it strikes me as so much more true to life that somebody who is doing something that Jesus did as a historical figure would have more of a support system than we ever see him having in depictions. But on the flip side of that kind of positive picture, we have Harvey Keitel, who is himself a Jewish actor, portraying Judas against Willem Dafoe, who is not. He's your typical blonde hair, blue-eyed, not Jewish Jesus. And Harvey Keitel is also a redhead. And I think about it a little bit like there was a lot of controversy around the casting in Jesus Christ Superstar, the actor who played Judas was a black man, against the actor who played Jesus, who's white and again blonde and blue-eyed. And there was some discomfort about that. And I don't know that there was much discomfort vocalized in the same sort of way around Harvey Keitel being a redheaded Judas, even though there's a very long history of Judas being depicted with red hair and that being used as part of anti-Semitic stereotyping of Jews. So there's quite a famous anti-Semitic picture of the wandering Jew, and he has long flowing red hair and a long flowing red beard.
The film has a kind of controversial reputation. 35 years later, it's still hard to come to it without that as your kind of frame. I don't think that was Martin Scorsese's agenda. And whilst he maybe thought there would be a bit of that, he wasn't necessarily surprised by the protests, and it was a kind of long process of the film getting made, and some of that was in the mix. At the same time, I think it was, pious seems quite the wrong word, but Scorsese's been fascinated by Catholicism and questions of God throughout his whole career. He was potentially going to be a priest at one stage and decided to be a filmmaker. And he's, said some quite alarming things about his faith. It's still a very real issue for him. Even, the fact that he made Silence 6 or 7 years ago, however many years after this film. One of the things he's kind of said a few times was when he was asked why he wanted to make this film, he said, so I can get to know Jesus better, which I think is a really interesting quote. And I know Kazantzakis said something similar about it. And I think when you look at some of the choices that are made around the accents and Harvey Keitel and so on, I think that makes some of those elements fit in a bit more. Leaving aside the red hair, we've talked about Keitel having the buddy role. Neither of them is necessarily an out-and-out hero, but they both are strong and relatively positive portrayals. And Judas is a very reluctant betrayer in this film. So I think there's quite a lot there in terms of coming from Mean Streets, where you've got De Niro and Keitel being his best friend, and that kind of dynamic is very much reproduced here, I think. And Keitel being critical to that, and having worked with Scorsese a lot, and I can understand the idea being pitched to him. But yeah, the red hair, and as I say, it's been used and not in a good way in church history. But again, I think we approach that in terms of recognizing the anti-Semitic history of some of those Christian works of art, most of those Christian works of art going back through history. But I don't know that would necessarily be something that Scorsese was necessarily that aware of. And you get this again and again with people making the stories of the Bible, making the films about the Bible. They're always homaging some of these earlier works and the painted works. So going right back to the very first Jesus films, a lot of which were almost literal reproductions of Tissot and Doré's Bible. DeMille in 1927, I think he boasts that he referenced 300 different paintings in his work. And Scorsese, there's a number of very deliberate representations of other works here, particularly the slow motion of Jesus carrying the cross through the streets. The end is very much riffs on the Bosch painting. And there's a scene of him towards the end of his life in the temptation sequence where you kind of get almost that kind of Manteiga shot of Jesus' feet closest to the camera that is very like that painting. So my hunch, certainly with the hair, is possibly that was an unthought through homage to some of those other works. I can't remember from the book whether Judas is described as being red-headed there. It might even come from there. But yeah, I think when you understand more of the context about it, it is quite an alarming choice.
And there's a similar issue with Orientalism as well. And I think there's a certain reflexivity to it. So your Jesus story draws from previous iterations consciously and unconsciously. We'd noticed this depiction of Mary Magdalene as a sex worker with all these other kind of trappings that have been associated with that in visual culture rather than with, let's say, quote-unquote, authenticity. I think that fits in very well with some of these other things, and you think, well, why would they deliberately do that? Because the film does seem to want to wrestle with ideas about identity and self-doubt. And these things are almost like a bit of a distraction. So there's a kind of unexamined thing. And I think that probably accounts for like some of the choices around the visuality of Judas.
Yeah, there's a lot of Orientalism in this film. It kind of really struck me watching it. I'm going to say more so than average. That's a weird thing to say.
No, I think you're correct. I think it's more overt.
Yeah, I think it's a deliberate strategy actually to make Jesus' world disorientating. Scorsese is a huge fan of the biblical epics and films like The Robe, King of Kings. There's a couple of homages to that as well. Greatest Story Ever Told as well. And I think in those films, the Orientalism still exists, but the world they're trying to put across is much more, as classically with epics, is much more this idea of people in the past weren't that different from us. Whereas this film is coming from the other point of view and is trying to make the point that this world was very different from our world, and to disorientate people and to throw people into a context they're not familiar with. Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, that's the way they went about it. I mean, Scorsese did do a lot of historical research for the film. There's a couple of key elements, particularly around the crucifixion. So this is, I think, the first Jesus film to show Jesus naked on the cross, and the position with the nail going through the heel bone. That was a relatively recent archaeological discovery at the time. I think it'd been about 10 years. But yeah, and so he does try and incorporate those things. But in terms of costume, the historical element then kind of disappears into a more orientalist take on stuff and going with vaguely it's the East, in more extreme fashions. So particularly, like say, the wedding at Cana.
I think you're entirely right on it being a disorienting thing. And I actually said to Joe that I feel like it's more of a fantasy than a period piece.
Yeah.
In the way that like some of our fantasy stuff is set in the medieval period, but it's not, it's not medieval. It's just medieval-ish. And I think that that's kind of what we're getting with The Last Temptation. And so actually, even though the Orientalism is much more overt than a lot of other Jesus films, it almost bothers me a little bit less, which is weird because I'm very bothered by Orientalism. Mm-hmm. But I think it's because it's doing that. It fits with Peter Gabriel's soundtrack.
Yeah.
The soundtrack also is like, this isn't a straight period piece. We're going to make it clearly 80s in some places and clearly contemporary in some places and then orchestral in some other places. But at the same time, Joe noticed that the Biblical Archaeological Review was thanked in the acknowledgements of the credits. So they did, like, to your point, that they did their research.
Like the nail heel bone, they had a really nice, it was like 2 seconds of a mikveh, like a ritual immersion bath. I've never seen one of those in a film. I love that they've got that because it's so contemporary with the scene they're doing. Things like when they're using oil lamp, there's lots of nice little details that like archaeologists go, oh yes, someone's told them that this is part of that. So maybe that's, we could call it disorientalizing or something.
Yeah, I mean, you notice some wax tablets in one scene too.
Oh yes, yeah.
But yeah, the costumes, no, there's nothing that nods
what about
to the
Pontius
historical.
Pilate?
A Pontius Pilate's costume?
Bowie.
Yeah, David Bowie.
Oh, I lost my mind when I saw that. I had no idea he was going to be in the film. It was excellent.
Oh, really?
Yeah. How about Pontius Pilate? Was he well costumed?
Oh, no.
He was another interesting character, actually.
No, that costume's incorrect. I mean,
Okay.
it's correct in that he's in a toga. So usually we get, particularly in like more contemporary Jesus films, we have Pilate in armor. And Pilate was there as a representative of Rome. And if he was presiding over any kind of trial or official thing, he would have been required by Rome to wear a toga for that role. So Life of Brian gets that right. Ben-Hur, 1959, William Wyler, Ben-Hur gets that right. And so it's right in that it's a toga, but it's just incorrect in what the toga looks like. It's not accurate in its actual appearance.
To me as well, it feels the epitome of, it just happens again and again in Jesus films, is that Pilate is always better looking or more relatable or more heroic than Caiaphas is. You can show pictures of the actors out of costume for any Jesus film, and you can always tell which one is going to be the Roman. I mean, this film, having an actual pop star against a very, there's literally zero nuancing around. I mean, I don't think they're even given names in this. I can't quite remember whether Caiaphas is actually used as a name, but there's a clear Caiaphas and Annas figure.
They have the high priest with the breastplate.
The chocolates.
Yeah,
My wife always calls those the chocolates.
Yes, and then another priestly figure next to him.
Who's wearing tefillin on his head. Yeah, they're not named, but they're clearly who they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a particularly bad portrayal of them. Well, not everyone loves David Bowie, but an actual pop star.
I love David Bowie.
So yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that.
It's very much there in Passion of the Christ as well. That that's another one where the gulf is extreme. It's less extreme in some, but it's usually very, very noticeable straight off who is the Roman and wants to wash his hands of all this stuff, and who is the high priest.
Yeah, mercifully, this movie doesn't show them for very long, and we don't get a trial, and so we don't have to deal with any of that stuff.
That's what I found interesting, because you don't have the trial of the high priest, which is a very recurring visual motif, a scene that's often recalled, often conflated with the Pharisees as well. Like the Pharisees often, if you ask people who
get chucked in as well, trial,
and they're nothing to do with it, but
they stop chapters ahead.
Yes, they've vanished.
It's absent from a couple other Jesus films also, though. It's not the first one to not have the trial. I always forget which one it is. Is it Greatest Story Ever Told that it's not in, or King of Kings? One of those two.
I think it's probably King of Kings.
Yeah, so
I can't remember off the top of my head.
And then I think also,
but King of Kings has that very strong line around the kind of Rome thing.
That one is the teenage Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And then I think it's the Jesus film also, the one from the 70s, doesn't have a trial scene.
No. Oh, okay.
I think. I'm expecting you to remember better than me, Matt, so...
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I don't think the Messiah, the Rossellini one, doesn't have it.
I want to ask one question. The Last Temptation of Christ goes for 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 40. If you could cut one thing out to make it shorter, what would you lose?
Oh, I mean, I do think it is a bit baggy, to be honest. I mean, I had to cut a lot of this out in my review in the book, but I think there are quite a few bits that don't massively work that well. I'm not a huge fan of the pulling the heart from the chest scene. There's various other bits and pieces. Off the top of my head, I think that kind of middle section, about 50% of the running length is Jesus' ministry. It could have done with a bit more taking out of that section generally.
I guess you're on the rails at that point with the gospel narrative, so it largely follows them, and the interesting thing are like the tweaks or something Jesus says off the back of like raising Lazarus. So there's like little bits that are interesting in it, but on the whole you're like, okay, I know what's happening.
Watching it the other night, I was much less conscious of that kind of boredom feeling that I think I've had, experienced in bits of that before. And it's such a funny experience watching it, because you kind of go from, there's some scenes that I think are brilliant, and I love the Sermon on the Mount scene. I've used that so many times, and various other bit, the kind of the dancing bit, and there's a meme of the Jesus giving cheers, isn't there, at the wedding in Cana, and how it can go quite quickly from a bit that is brilliant. And again, when I first watched this and had only really seen a lot of like stodgy films that had a real energy and a aliveness to it, to then being bits that feel a bit slow and self-indulgent.
Matt, it's been so great having you with us today, but before we let you go, we'd love for you to pitch us a pairing. This can be anything at all that you would pair with The Last Temptation of Christ. It could be a drink, a food, another movie, a book, an article, a piece of music. The sky is the limit.
the companion piece I would choose, and we have kind of mentioned it already, but I think I would choose Silence, the 2016 Scorsese film. Just because, if you've had 2 3/4 hours of Last Temptation, then another 3 hours of a slow moving angst is probably just what you're after. But I think I just find that the gap in the process and those kind of two films, they feel like they go together.
Thanks so much for being here today, Matt. It's been a real pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great fun.
That's our show today. Gods and Movie Makers is researched and produced by us, Joe Scales and Katie Turner, and supported by listeners like you. Our music is by Style the Kid. As always, you can follow us at GodMavPod on Twitter and Instagram. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, head on over to our website, godsandmoviemakers.com, where you can donate to us or subscribe for additional content. Thanks for listening.